Hey guys, this is Asad. This week I'm reviewing a four-table match I played a couple months ago against Sauce, who I guess needs no formal introduction and is the polar opposite of an anonymous opponent. But he sat me and asked if I wanted to play four tables, and while I don't think this is a profitable venture, I do think it's fun and interesting to play against one of the best players in the world and a good way to assess your game and learn things. It's definitely going to be informative and educational, especially seeing a player of this caliber adjust to your tendencies and ranges and really analyze all the showdowns. That's going to be very helpful for your own game. So without further ado, I'm going to roll the footage. I have about 2 hours, and I'm not going to spoil how the match went, but I will say there were a lot of interesting spots and it was quite swingy. Top right table, I 3-bet 7-9 suited, which against 3x is fine, although I do think it's strong enough to call. I wanted to establish a pretty aggressive dynamic pre. I don't know much about how much no limit he's been playing, but given the state of today's high stakes no limit games, I can only assume that he's been putting in more hours at PLO. I expected him to peel 3-bets really wide for that reason, and while that doesn't really make a good case for 3-betting 7-9 suited, I do think that I wanted to stick with my original game plan of being aggro pre early in the match and getting a good idea of how he was going to respond and react to that sort of dynamic. So I checked this flop, which I think I would be forced to do with a lot of my range, and having a hand like 7-9 of spades in this spot is extremely good for that reason. I think a 7 will get barreled pretty often, given that it gives a lot of the hands that he called a 3-bet with more equity to barrel with, and obviously spades are good. I don't think that he will be making the assumption that I'll have hands like this in my range when I check, since I don't expect him to really know anything about my game yet. Top left table, I flatted pre with queen 10 suited and check called the flop. You could definitely make a case for both 3-betting this hand pre and check raising the flop for value, but I did want to get a better sense of how he was playing in single raise pots, and I think the best way to do that and get the showdown early is by taking a more passive approach and allowing him to keep betting with the initiative. The turn on the top right is a pretty interesting spot when I check, because I do think when against a player who's so aware of ranges and whose range is stronger when, it's going to be pretty obvious that I have a hand with showdown value when I check the turn here, since he should expect most of the air hands that I give up by not c-betting the flop here to bet turn. Then when I check, it's pretty obvious that I have a hand like 9x, usually without spades or 10s, jacks, and something along those lines. So when I check, I do expect to get bluffed, and bluffed again pretty often, especially since it's a lot easier for him to have clubs than for me to have clubs. Although, I do think that a lot of his club hands would just start by bluffing the flop when I check. So something to keep in mind, but it's a weird spot, and I do think that he'll be aware of how weak my range is when I check flop and then check call turn here. And that's definitely the reason why I chose to check call turn with this specific hand, because I think I have a lot of implied odds to be bluffed, basically, especially on spades. Even though it's very tough for him to rep spades when they come in on the river, it's also just very tough for me to call down with most of my range. So top left, I'm just going to continue to check call on the 10. Obviously a really good card and decent river. It's a good river because it completes a backdoor flush, and I don't think it's going to get bluffed too often since most of my range is queen x when I check call twice, but it's possible. He's definitely capable of anything and everything. So I folded pretty quickly with 7-9, which I don't like. I think early in the match I'm probably better off just calling, and there's a case to be made for not giving him more information than he needs, but I do think it's just plus EV to call there, and I'll be good enough. Laid a nice cooler on him in the top left. We exchanged a bunch of coolers early in the match, just as a disclaimer. Top right, I flat a 3-bet standardly with 10-8 suited and peel the flop. Not a hand that I really want to be raising on this board until we get deeper. Going to stick to the plan and call again when he bets. Expecting him to want to be 3-barreling a lot when he bets twice on this board, since he'll realize that most of my hands are pair plus draw, pair plus gut shot, whatever, that call twice and potentially fold river. Not a great river here on the top right, although I do think that it sort of improves his absolute strength hand. I think his relative hand strength goes down on a king, and he did have ace-10, which he check called, which I like. I think it's a spot where he should expect me correctly to turn a lot of my weaker showdown value hands into a bluff. Looks like I'm sticking to the plan and 3-betting a lot here early on. Check raise in the top right is fine. I think he probably c-bets this board too often, and I can get a lot of fold equity since I have so many queens, and he'll realize that. It's one of the better hands to be check raising in that spot. Few interesting hands coming up here. I check called twice with 5s, which I did for a couple reasons. Firstly, he's opening 100% to 3x, and he should realize that when he's 3xing, it's almost impossible for me to have any combos of 6-4. He might think that I'm 3-betting 6-4 suited and folding 6-4 off, so he'll have 100% of combos of 6-4. And I also think that he just has plenty of hands to barrel with, gut shots, open-enders, whatever. And he'll value bet thinly on the river and turn, so it's definitely a situation where having a hand as strong as I do is good for my overall range, and definitely the most profitable line with this hand in this spot early in the match until we have some real dynamics. Bottom left table, I call a 3-bet with King Jack of diamonds. I'm going to float this flop for sure, especially with the backdoor flush draw. King and a Jack are really good for me, and I expect them to get barreled off on pretty often, or often enough. He actually chatted quite a bit during this match, which I thought was pretty cool. Here he's saying he thinks that PLO has messed up his game, and he wants me to let him know if he's playing this game too tight, which I find hard to believe that he would have that issue, but looks like I made a turn over bet there in the top right with Jack 10 on 8-9-5-5, or I guess it was 8-7-5-5. Let's just go back quickly. Too far. So it's a cool spot to overbet. I think that this board gets check called pretty light, especially when he's defending 60% of hands. I expect Sauce to defend more hands than the average player because his approach is pretty mathematical and generally pretty GTO. So I think when I overbet this turn, he's just going to be put in a really difficult spot with a lot of his range. And I do expect him to check raise 6-9 and a lot of his stronger hands on this flop more often. So I think this turn overbet, slight overbet, yields plenty of folds and definitely sets up a nice spot to make a bet on the river on a lot of different river runoffs. Bottom left, turn a diamond. I think this is a turn where a lot of people might be tempted to shove, and it looks like I'm scrolling over to shove myself, but I would never actually do that. I just like to play with the bet slider while I'm playing. So I think you need to be calling again here, and that's because I'm going to want to be calling this turn with much weaker hands than this. Even though this is a semi-bluff, I think it has a lot of great implied odds in the sense that he'll bluff the cards that improve my hand a ton. Maybe not specifically the 4 of diamonds, but a king or a jack I think always get bluffed by any hand that bets the turn that doesn't have showdown value. And I also think that he can value bet very light himself, so I don't think that a 7, like a good 7, the 3-bet would really slow down on a king or a jack, expecting me to think that he'd always bluff, so he can bet for value against ace high or a 6 that I turned. Top left, I check raise all in. Not really too much to be said, although he does make a call with a hand that I think is too light. I guess I won't spoil it. It's a spot where when I check call the flop and turn and then check raise the river, he shouldn't expect me to really have too many bluffs. I have all combos of ace-4, I have some combos of 3x of spades, and it's just really hard for me to be check calling twice with a hand like 5-4 and then check raising all in, for the reasons that I stated before, since it's impossible for me to have 6-4 and he can have all of them. So, you know, it's fine to call there. He's obviously calling just to get a better sense of how I play. He might expect me to check raise a hand like that always, like 5s, I mean, or 5-3 or something like that. So I don't mind his call, although I do think it's pretty difficult for me to be check calling twice and then check raising all in with something that beats 10 or doesn't beat 10s. Table 4, I 3-bet and get a pretty draw-heavy flop here with jacks. I'm going to start by checking, and if the board was a little bit less draw-heavy, I would lean towards a small check raise or a check call even. But given how dynamic this board is and how many hands he's going to be willing to just bet call, depending on my 3-bet percentage, which at this point was pretty high, I felt better about check raising all in, just expecting to have enough pairs that would bet call happily here. And he did have queen 10, but I do think that it's possible he would bet call like good 9s and potentially even weaker than that. There's some draws that he would bet call as well.